You touched on the three-step protocol. Could you please explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yes. So okay. So to reiterate, first thing I want to reiterate, women should not get alarmed that they have adenomyosis. Most patients get successful pregnancy. A lot of patients get successful pregnancy naturally without even knowing they have adenomyosis. Usually gets detected later on when they have investigation for other reasons like heavy period, painful period. So then if they don't get successful pregnancy naturally, then simple IVF and transfer of embryo. And with that, most patients get successful pregnancy because you're transferring high-grade embryos in controlled condition frequently enough and with the progesterone support. That's sufficient. And this three-stage protocol generally recommended in patients with repeated implantation failure. So we're transferring 3-4 high-grade embryos without implantation. Then we assume, okay, so this patient's age was 35. Statistically, 1 in 3 embryos should have a good chance of implantation for that age. That's nature's limit is a 1 in 3 for high-grade embryos for the age of 35. Among these 3-4 embryos we transferred, at least one of them must have had optimal condition for implantation, but still didn't implant. So there is a uterine cause for that. In this patient, adenomyosis is impacting implantation so much that needs treatment. And that's in patients with repeated implantation failure. Or we preemptively or proactively use this three-stage treatment in women who cannot easily produce high-grade embryo. Let us say their age is 40, 41, and it is not easy for them to create high-grade embryos. It may take 1 cycle to create only 1 high-grade embryo or 2 cycles. So for these patients, we preemptively first treat adenomyosis after banking, then transfer embryo to give each embryo best possible chance. So very much this decision is individualized. Again, that my Adenomyosis 360 book explains which patients should have a 3-stage treatment, which patients should not have a 3-stage treatment as a first-line treatment. So essentially, in 3-stage treatment idea is to treat adenomyosis. You cannot cure adenomyosis because those cells already in the wall of the uterus, they are stem cells. Endometrial cells are stem cells. Stem cells means they stay there. Whenever you have a high estrogen, they get activated. Whenever you have a progesterone, you have a discharge. You cannot remove from the wall. So you cannot surgically remove. If you try to remove adenomyosis surgically, you can cause a lot of scar tissue inside the uterus. No, you shouldn't even attempt treating adenomyosis surgically. Only thing you can do is treatment, not the cure, treatment. Treatment means you suppress them, put them back to sleep, and open implantation window long enough to get successful pregnancy. So idea is you want to have a sufficient number of embryos banked up, waiting for the transfer once this adenomyosis has been treated. If you don't do that, let us say you just treated adenomyosis straight away, then you did the IVF, and you're not getting high-grade embryos easily. So by the time you start getting high-grade embryos, every month you do stimulation, then adenomyosis comes back. And your adenomyosis treatment may be wasted, and you're back to square one, and you start again. So, because statistically, depending on the age, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 embryos have any capacity to become a baby. So let us say if you've banked 6 embryos for the age of, let us say, 35, statistically there will be at least 1 or 2 entirely healthy embryos. If you banked only 3 embryos, you may or may not have an embryo which is capable. Doesn't matter whether you have adenomyosis or not, the embryo has got its own chance for implantation, and for each embryo it's not equal. So for one embryo, 0 chance. Doesn't matter how good your uterus, it doesn't implant. It can look healthy whether you do PGT testing or not. That embryo doesn't have a chance. Another embryo may have a 90% chance, which means even if uterus is not very optimal, when you transfer, very likely it's going to implant. But for that, you need to remove the adenomyosis. And another embryo, chance may be 60%. So that embryo, the implants, when everything is optimal, which means entirely healthy uterus. So each embryo's chance of implantation is different. So, which means if you have 3 embryos, if you don't have any embryo which is optimal before adenomyosis treatment, then after treatment, your likelihood of success is low. So generally, depending on the age, it's recommended sufficient amount of embryos in the bank, which gives you 90-95% chance of successful pregnancy. So, which means, yes, even after adenomyosis treatment, there's a possibility of not successful pregnancy. But if you banked a good number of embryos, that possibility is quite low, maybe 5%, 10%. So, so generally it's recommended to, in 3-stage treatment, your first stage is banking, IVF, 1, maybe 2 or 3 cycles, depending on how many hybrids you're producing, banking, which is freezing all of high-grade embryos. Second stage is the treatment of adenomyosis. Third stage is transfer. So once you banked enough embryos, so the treatment involves stopping your pituitary gland to produce stimulation hormones. Like FSH hormones you use in IVF or trigger hormones you use in IVF, you produce naturally. So naturally when you produce FSH grows follicle produce estrogen, then ovulation, then progesterone. So you need to break that cycle because the adenomyosis get flared when you're ovulating, when your estrogen peaks. So that's actually the activator signal. So when you use a GnRH analog, it stops your pituitary from producing that stimulation FSH hormone. You produce a very low level of estrogen from antral follicles. So ovaries will be working even when you're on Prostap or Zoladex GnRH analog, but it will be producing very tiny amount of estrogen from antral follicles, but none of the follicles become bigger than 1 centimeter, start producing high level of estrogen, and you don't ovulate and you don't produce progesterone. So, and it is not menopausal. In menopause, you stop producing progesterone altogether because you do not have antral follicles. It's not temporary menopause. It's just temporarily you have a low estrogen state. That estrogen is enough for your body, for your skin, for your nervous system, but not enough for adenomyosis to get activated. So what happens is it's like rebooting, resetting, like you reset the computer, you reset or reboot the uterus. So you give a uterus break from this monthly estrogen. Then what happens is your immune cells have enough time to catch up and remove all abnormal endometrial dead tissue from the muscle, and they physically repair the muscle. So physically they clean and repair the muscle, and the whole fluid goes away. Uterus becomes smaller, it's not swollen. It becomes like new, like rebooted, healthy uterus. So, and for that you need to give that GnRH analogs like Zoladex, Prostap long enough. 1 month, 2 months doesn't work. Why? Because when you use Prostap, first month Zoladex doesn't work. Because once FSH-LH stops from being produced, then it takes at least 3-4 weeks before your uterus even realizes the signal is not coming or ovaries realize. So really you need to give him approximately 4 months to 6 months to have a sufficient effect to improve your implantation. Minimum 3 months, maybe 4 to 6 months. In patients with adenomyoma, which is a chocolate cyst of the uterus because of adenomyosis, you need 6 months of treatment to remove this old cells which have been there for many, many years, and then repair. In patients with milder adenomyosis, maybe 4 months is sufficient. So, so you give a monthly injection and reduce the estrogen and let the immune system to heal and repair the uterus. Then after that, you start transferring the embryos. All these injections do not cause any long-term negative impact to fertility. So temporarily, yes, you don't have ovulation and you have a low estrogen, but it doesn't cause any like menopause, any long-term negative impact to egg quality or egg reserve. It doesn't have any negative impact to fertility. Why? Because these injections do not even interact with ovary. Ovary doesn't even know that you're on injection. Simply, ovary doesn't receive a signal for stimulation. So then once you stop the injections, 4 weeks after the injection, your pituitary starts producing hormone, then whole thing should go back to normal. But here we don't want to go back to normal. We want to get successful pregnancy. After pregnancy, then your ovaries will be back to normal. So temporarily, in most patients tolerate these injections well. Some patients have some side effects of low estrogen, some hot flashes, irritability, but these are all temporary. And after injections stopped, then after stimulation of ovaries for transfer cycle, then all symptoms will go away. So yes, so 3-stage means first stage banking, sufficient amount of embryos. Second stage is treatment of adenomyosis by reducing estrogen by using monthly GnRH analog like Zoladex, Prostap, Lupron, Decapeptyl. These are all GnRH analog drugs. They're very safe. They've been in use more than 40 years. It's very common for patients with severe endometriosis, pelvic pain, or fibroids to use. We know their safety profile, and they're generally very safe. So then the third stage is a transfer. So transfer is, in my protocol, you can read in the book, is the best way of waking up ovaries is using stimulated frozen. Let us say you did last injection, wait for 4 weeks, then you need to wake up the ovary so that you produce your natural estrogen and grow your endometrial lining and prepare for implantation. Let us say you did monthly injection. After last injection, you wait for 4 weeks before your ovaries wake up on its own, before having any menstrual period. You wake up the ovary by using very low dose of FSH hormone. Usually we use leftover drug from fresh cycle. Let us say you were on Gonalep or Purigon, whatever FSH drug you were on, then you have a leftover drug or you buy a new drug and use a very low dose, usually 75 units, depending on result, 75 units in average. You use daily to wake up the ovaries, very importantly, without having any menstrual period. The last menstrual period happens before you do Zoladex, like 4 months before. Then without having menstrual period, you use a low dose of FSH drug to wake up the ovaries. Then you monitor how ovaries responding. You should start, because always there is an antral follicle sitting. Whether you do the Zoladex or not, always there's a follicles ready for stimulation. Then those follicles start growing, produce estrogen. Then when you say couple of large follicles, you do trigger shot. Then 7 days after trigger, you transfer. It's called stimulated frozen cycle. So last injection of Prostap or Zoladex after 4 weeks, you, without having any menstrual period, you do blood tests, day 1 bloods, then injections of low dose of FSH drug on its own. You monitor. Once you say good level of estrogen hormone, good number of growing follicles. Once you see large follicle, you trigger. Then 7 days after, you transfer, and you start progesterone a few days before the transfer. So it is a stimulated natural cycle. In this cycle, you produce natural estrogen and your natural progesterone. Then you stay on additional progesterone at least until 12 weeks. So here, it improves implantation. Let us say you have a high-grade embryo, your age is 35, you have 35% chance of successful implantation without, if you don't have any adenomyosis and uterine problem. If you have adenomyosis, that can get reduced for that embryo 22%, 25%. After treatment, that can get up increased to 25, 30%. So generally, it won't go back to the state where you don't have adenomyosis, but it will improve the chance per embryo. So if you have a lot of high-grade embryos frozen, very likely one of these embryos will work. Hopefully first one works or the second one. So usually you come to the embryo which has full capacity to implant, which could be any of these 6 embryos or 7 embryos or 8 embryos. So the more the embryo you bind, the higher chance of successful implantation. In some patients, if they don't bind sufficient amount of embryos, then you can repeat all over again. Another IVF, get more embryos, more Zoladex, then try again. But that's quite stressful because you're back to square one and you have a longer journey. It's better to bank sufficient amount of embryo to give very high chance of successful pregnancy. So that's the 3-stage treatment. Like I said, I want to emphasize, like endometriosis, adenomyosis is common. Like in endometriosis, a lot of women get successful pregnancy naturally or by just doing simple IVF in adenomyosis. But if it doesn't work, there is an option, which is a 3-stage protocol, which I created in this book, and I did a lot of videos on this. So that is usually like backup plan, and that usually gives